Chances are, if you are Canadian, you have heard or seen a land acknowledgement, which sounds like this.
We want to begin by acknowledging the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on which Wilfrid Laurier University's campuses sit and which we are currently occupying. This land is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty and is governed by the Haldimand Tract Proclamation, which promised 6 miles on either side of the Grand River to be the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee in 1784. Since this time, 95% of this land has been stolen through the ongoing colonial occupation of Turtle Island. And we are currently complicit in this colonial occupation. Only 5% of this land remains the traditional territory of Six Nations at the reserve. So it's really important for those of us who are non-Indigenous to Turtle Island to reflect on our relationships to the land.
There are now Indigenous land acknowledgements at the start of university events, such as graduation ceremonies or guest speaker presentations, as well as at the bottom of emails, on the side of buildings, and on course syllabi. And more, these acknowledgements are becoming mandated. So in the English department at Wilfrid Laurier University, for example, all course syllabi must contain a printed land acknowledgement, and at the 588 schools of the Toronto District School Board, a land acknowledgement must be recited every single morning, and a lot of school boards across the country are doing this as well. As you watch this video, keep in mind that I think it's fine that some people want to recite Indigenous land acknowledgements. It's actually very appropriate in some circumstances, like at an event hosted by Indigenous people. So in this video, I am mostly addressing when self-important white people recite Indigenous land acknowledgements. It's also considered very politically incorrect to question or criticize these land acknowledgements, but that's what I want to do here because there's barely any critique out there. Again, people can recite these acknowledgements all they want, but I want to offer an alternative view so that people can decide for themselves whether they find these land acknowledgements helpful or not. The first time I ever heard a land acknowledgement, back in 2014 or 2015, I was pretty intrigued, so it's good for people to be exposed to them, but once you've heard them a couple dozen times, you do start to see through it a bit. Also, I'll go into this later in the video, but I don't think it's land acknowledgements alone that pose any major problem. It's the ideology behind them that often extends to bigger issues. Let's dive in then. When white people recite land acknowledgements, it comes off to me as rather slimy. There are generally two types of people who recite Indigenous land acknowledgements. The first type is the university administration bureaucrat who's just kind of forced to do this and doesn't really care. But the other type is the person who gives the land acknowledgement and they do it in a very self-congratulatory way. And you can tell by the tone of their voice that they're so proud of themselves for giving this acknowledgement. They feel like they're a very amazing person and they are dripping with self-satisfaction. Clearly, for this self-congratulatory individual, they benefit from giving the land acknowledgement because it helps their self-image. It doesn't actually really help anybody else. They just enjoy coming off as socially progressive, and maybe they think of themselves as quite avant-garde or different. I also think that if you are someone who recites Indigenous land acknowledgements, but you don't simultaneously advocate for handing the entire country back over to Indigenous people, you are a complete hypocrite. There's something so laughable about acknowledging you live on stolen land in a very preachy way, but having no intention of actually giving the land back, which you believe vehemently is stolen. You'd rather just publicly clear your conscience. And I have voiced my opinion on this hypocrisy on social media in the past, and I did get some responses from Indigenous allies saying things like, yeah, well, we are going to give the land back, that's what we're going to do. But it is my understanding that they don't have any kind of master plan in place as to how they're going to transfer governments over to the First Nations chiefs. But if anyone knows where I can access this plan, please let me know. You will definitely be very familiar with land acknowledgements if you're involved in the educational sphere in Canada, but while I was in Australia, I noticed they were all over it too. I attended a speaking event in Sydney where the moderator gave a land acknowledgement, though in Australia they're called an acknowledgement of country. And you could tell by his voice he was so proud of himself for being so woke. And then he ended up asking the speakers about his land acknowledgement during the question time. And honestly, this was not a very well thought out question on his part because one of the speakers was a Brit and the other was American, so you can't really expect them to be familiar with the politics of these acknowledgements. But the American speaker was Dr. Cornel West, and even he was very skeptical of these land acknowledgements, and he said, "What is the point of reciting them if you aren't doing anything material to help the Indigenous population?" And I'm paraphrasing, but this was his point, basically, and I agree. There is no doubt that a lot of Indigenous people struggle in Canada. There is a lot of abuse against women and children, higher rates of fetal alcohol syndrome, some reservations don't have access to clean drinking water, high youth suicide rates in some communities, and more. These social problems are generally connected to what is termed the intergenerational trauma of the residential schools. So I find the improvement of these material and social conditions to be the most important thing. A couple of years back, there was a youth suicide crisis in the community of Attawapiskat, so we should ask, are there enough recreational activities and job opportunities for the youth there? A lot of reservations are quite remote, so are public health campaigns reaching the people up there in terms of how to eat a healthy diet or how to have a healthy pregnancy? Giving a land acknowledgement does not address these material and social conditions of Indigenous people in this country, which is why I find land acknowledgements completely self-serving on the part of the person who is reciting them. The next issue that ties in here is the up-and-coming phenomenon, usually only seen among leftist university students, where non-Indigenous people will refer to themselves as settlers, guests, or visitors on Indigenous land, even though they were born here. Some people might think this is harmless because it's just a matter of words, but I think this goes much deeper because it represents people's very relationship to their homeland and environment. Here's a couple examples. Acknowledge that we are visitors on the traditional territory, uninvited guests, we settlers, Canadians are guests on this land and Indigenous people are the hosts. I am a white settler living in the traditional unceded Algonquin territory. I am living on stolen land. I am an uninvited guest on unceded Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh territory. No, I read that wrong. Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory. Uninvited guests. I am as white as they come. I am an uninvited guest. Recognition of our position as guests on this land. White settler. Queer white settler. Stolen land, rent is due. Settlers pay up. On my part, you will never brainwash me into thinking that I am an uninvited guest in the country that I was born in and have a deep attachment to, and where my family has lived for generations. I have roots here and I contribute to my country, so calling myself some sort of uninvited white settler would not accurately reflect reality. And what's also very flawed about this idea of calling non-Indigenous people guests or settlers is realistically only white people are expected to call themselves this. I've definitely seen non-white people refer to themselves as settlers, but they are not the people who are expected to repent for historical colonial sins. And honestly, I have no idea what the average Indigenous person thinks about white people calling themselves guests and settlers and doing land acknowledgements. Maybe they think it's dumb. It's too bad because I can really only go off of what I see from the elite Indigenous activists on social media, and obviously that is so not representative of the average Indigenous person. Another issue I want to address is the idea that Indigenous people are the caretakers and custodians of the land, and that they are all intuitive environmentalists. I've always had a problem with this idea because I know that you don't have to be Indigenous to be an intuitive environmentalist. For instance, I live my life according to minimalist principles, and I don't want to list off all the things I do that make me an environmentally conscious person because that can come off as annoying. But, for example, the most important and significant thing is that I'm a vegetarian. So look at this land acknowledgement, which states, we are grateful for all the Indigenous people who continue to care for this land. Hate to break it to you, but a lot of Indigenous people actually don't care about conserving the environment, and one culture should not be the designated caretakers of the land. In a fourth-year sociology course that I took almost 2 years ago, we had to respond to a short Al Jazeera-produced film that was about the Standing Rock protests. And the message of the film was basically about how Native American people are the caretakers of the land. So in my paper, I decided to take a risk and write about how I reject this narrative that Indigenous people are the God-given caretakers of the land. And I argued that if you keep telling people that, non-Indigenous people will feel like they have no obligation to care about the earth because that is only the domain of Indigenous people. So in other words, I argued that it is not in anyone's interest for environmentalism or natural resource conservation to become an Indigenous thing, because it should be anyone's thing. And although I didn't write this in my paper, I kind of think to myself, how long is it until caring about the environment becomes stealing Indigenous culture? I was a bit worried about my grade for that course, because the TA marking that paper, I believe, was an Indigenous woman, and I wasn't sure how she'd react. But I ended up getting an A+, and the TA praised me and completely agreed with me about these counterproductive stereotypes, which she said were a repackaging of the noble savage stereotype. So that was a great feeling, and actually one of the first times in my university career where I wrote what I truly thought in a paper, and it ended up really paying off. In closing then, I'll reiterate. If someone takes it upon themselves to do a land acknowledgement before a university event or whatever, or wants to put it in the signature of their email, that's totally fine and good for them. I just have a problem when it's mandated. I like history, and Indigenous history is just as interesting as the history of any other people on the planet. But Canada is simply not at risk of forgetting that Indigenous people were here first. One of the first things you learn in grade 2 or 3 is that Canada itself is an Indigenous word. And the places in Canada, the names of provinces, territories, cities, regions, etc., are a mix of colonial and Indigenous, and I think that's good. We have Victoria, British Columbia, and Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, but we also have Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and Iqaluit, Nunavut. And the capital of our country is Ottawa, Ontario, and both Ottawa and Ontario are Indigenous words. And I think the Indigenous names we have for some of our provinces and cities are beautiful and unique names. I think maybe getting people interested in the history embedded in the names of the places is much more productive than the mindless reciting of a self-congratulatory land acknowledgement. I hope that some middle school or high school students were able to stumble upon this video, because again, you most likely won't be exposed to the arguments that I just presented at school. I am worried about how much this is going on in our public schools, how this guilt tripping will affect non-Indigenous people's relationship to their country and to the earth. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to reading your comments. And again, if you know where to find the master plan, where we are transferring governments over to First Nation chiefs and giving all the land back, then please direct me to that resource.